very safe. It's not too...
Just disappear now and then.
Para poner el vaso de agua. ¿Y esto tiene que estar ahí? Okay. You will see your presentation. Oh, that's awful. It's awful. No?
Disappear.
Okay, I think we should start at 6:15, no more than that.
Yeah.
Yes, they just finished the workshop right now. So they are coming. Some of them.
She looks familiar.
Soledad? Yes. She's from King's College and working with the Hemiciclo.
Okay.
And she's working on smuggling, migrant smuggling, and transit migration.
Yeah, we probably need to start.
Yes. Buenas tardes. Por favor, les pedimos pasar porque ya vamos a comenzar con la conferencia. Bueno, bienvenidas, bienvenidos a esta conferencia magistral del Sexto Congreso sobre Trata de Personas y Tráfico de Migrantes, que tiene el tema Causas estructurales y políticas de prevención. Es un honor para mí presentar a Kamala Kempadoo. Ella es una socióloga de origen caribeño, profesora del Departamento de Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de York, en Canadá. Se especializa en estudios de género y desarrollo, las relaciones entre economía y comercio sexual y análisis críticos en torno a los discursos y acciones en contra de la trata de mujeres. Bueno, fue justamente por esta visión crítica y el trabajo investigativo riguroso que tiene Kamala Kempadoo en temas de trata y de comercio sexual que le hemos invitado como conferencista magistral. Kamala fue integrante de la Alianza Global contra las Mujeres, tiene una extensas publicaciones de libros, artículos sobre el tema de la trata con esta visión crítica que les he mencionado. Y en los dos últimos años ella ha recibido importantísimos reconocimientos a su larga trayectoria académica. En 2017 recibió un reconocimiento de la Sociedad Científica de Estudios sobre Sexualidad, que reconoció el aporte que ha hecho Kamala Kempadoo a los estudios sobre sexualidad. Y este año recibió también un reconocimiento de la Asociación de Estudios Caribeños, que destacó el largo trabajo académico interdisciplinar que ha hecho Kamala Kempadoo sobre el Caribe. Entonces, con estas visiones críticas, Kamala nos presenta su conferencia Las trampas de las políticas antitrata. Adelante, Kamala.
Good evening, everybody. And I apologize that I can't speak to you in Spanish. I've tried to learn it, but it didn't really stick. But thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Marta. Cecilia, for extending the invitation, and thank you to the organizers of this Congress for having me, asking me to speak here this evening to you all. I know you're all very busy and have been working all day, but I'd like to share with you some of my insights and ideas about trafficking from the years that I've been working on it. And the title of my talk, Pitfalls of Anti-Trafficking, draws from the work of Frantz Fanon. I think some of you might be familiar with that. If you're, in his first edition of Wretched of the Earth, he used the terms the pitfalls of national consciousness to speak about the neoliberal, neocolonial and liberal nationalism. And I think it's a useful way to think about anti-trafficking. Because I see anti-trafficking as also a particular kind of consciousness that comes about. I'm arguing that this kind of consciousness, echoing Fanon, rather than being a product of popular mobilization, is nothing but a crude and empty shell that is mobilized by the elite. Right? So I want to focus here on that, what I'm calling this crude and empty shell, maybe not so crude, but empty, of anti-trafficking, and to talk about it in greater detail, about what some of the work that this consciousness does. So first of all, human trafficking, as I think everybody here recognizes, is a very contested, highly contested idea and issue. From a critical perspective, the awareness about it and the interventions that arise from it to counter trafficking, so-called anti-trafficking, are often referenced as an industry, which we're all part of, a discourse, a narrative, sometimes a myth, a moral panic, or more recently, as a rhetoric. These kind of references point to anti-trafficking as a set of beliefs, arguments, representations, or practices that operate to persuade, control, and profit from working and marginalized people. The anti-trafficking discourse or rhetoric wants us to believe that trafficking exists. Yet we have seen over the years, and centuries I would say, how the idea of trafficking is slippery, and very ill-defined. So to just recount what I think many of you know here, is that the idea of anti-trafficking started in reference to prostitution in the early 20th century around the International Agreement of Suppression of the White Slave Traffic, which aimed to prevent the procuring of women and children for immoral purposes abroad. Right? So within this early discourse, prostitution was defined as immoral and was imagined as violence to women. And it is here that a foundation was laid to conflate and to collapse prostitution and trafficking, as well as to link trafficking to border crossings, to migrations. So this early discourse about the white slave trade was moreover a racialized social panic about what was believed to be the entrapment and enslavement of predominantly white Western, European, and North American women in prostitution. And often the traffickers were believed or portrayed to be the ethnic or cultural or racial other, particularly South American, Native American, and black men. So we can see it also lays the foundations for a racialization. And that still persists, I argue, and I'll come back to that in a while. But we also know by the mid-20th century, a shift in the discourse occurred. So in the 1949 UN International Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Women and the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others was introduced. And this suggests that even though trafficking involved more than women, it was still aimed to prevent prostitution and the accompanying evil of the traffic in persons for the purpose of prostitution. I'm just quoting from that convention. In other words, in 1949, there was a gesture to a broader idea of trafficking, yet it remained retained prostitution and a cross-border focus. So fast forward to 2000, and the idea of trafficking broadened further through the UN Protocol on Trafficking, which is attached to the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And we see here a separation, beginning separation between the idea of trafficking and prostitution, and a clearer link to transnational organized crime. But we know also that today the idea of trafficking is no longer tied to border crossing. And I'm going to put this up. And it includes other instances of forced, undocumented labor, migration, all forced or debt-bonded labor, so-called modern-day slavery, such as sweatshop work, camel jockeying, begging, prison labor, young people. And in Canada, Aboriginal women are included, Indigenous women, and this is sometimes talked about as domestic trafficking. And then we also see asylum seekers and refugees, such as the Rohingya and the Syrians, and I think probably also the Venezuelans, and economic migrants. So we have, this is in English, I'm sorry, but what is often included in trafficking are a list of very many kinds of activities, sometimes all sex work, low-wage work, forced debt-bonded labor, and it's come to signify, I feel, almost anything that's wrong with the world. And just last week, I was speaking with a colleague of mine at York. She's doing some work in Jamaica, and she was talking about how women there are beginning to disappear in connection with the lottery scams that are happening, and which is fueling gang wars, corruption, and homicide. And she wanted to talk about it in terms of trafficking. So I was saying, why is it trafficking? They're missing and murdered women. But why would we call that trafficking? She didn't have a good answer. But in Canada, too, there's a lot of slippage between that idea of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and trafficking going on today. So a lot of things are being included, and that definition of trafficking is getting broader and broader as we go further. So we know that the rhetoric of trafficking was first advocated in the public sphere by British and American middle class and upper class feminists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by women who were wanting to restore the fallen daughters to their righteous place as decent women, wives, and mothers. It was quickly taken up by conservative religious, especially Christian groups, and deployed in social purity campaigns. Later, it was adopted by national and international NGOs, especially those working around violence against women. And more recently, academics and Hollywood celebrities have joined the campaigns, as well as transnational business elites. However, the anti-prostitution sentiment that initiated the rhetoric has held sway. And despite its expanded meaning, all those kind of terms, anti-trafficking interventions affect the sex trade the most. It is the brothels, the sex clubs, the strip joints, the massage parlors, and so forth, that are most commonly raided in the name of anti-trafficking. It is there that women are rescued and the evils of trafficking are most readily imagined. Indeed, the image that is conjured up, and still, this is what my students come into my classes thinking, that we have, oops, where have my slides gone? These kind of images, they're all individual. This is what, to them, the idea of trafficking is, of young, innocent women, helpless, captured, locked in a brothel, perhaps, a young woman who's incapable of shaping her own circumstances, completely incapable of any kind of agency. And we see this time and time again in the media and in anti-trafficking campaigns, and I'm sure you have your own versions in South America and Latin America of this. Now, what is important to note is that very few sex worker organizations are represented as part of the anti-trafficking movement or seen as important actors in the development of anti-trafficking campaign discourse. Indeed, they're most commonly absented, and the underlying connection of prostitution and trafficking maintains the idea that sex work can only be conceived of as force and violence to women and girls. We need also to be attentive to the ways in which anti-trafficking discourse produces statistics to support its claims. The figures that circulate globally are wild. They vary considerably, depending on what they are referring to. For example, only forced sex work, or minors in sex work, or all unregulated labor practices, are all irregular migrants and refugees, trafficked persons. Should we count all prostitution, pornography, exotic dancing, webcam, and phone sex as part of the trafficking debate? Where does trafficking begin and end? I think it's an important question. We need to keep asking ourselves, what do we mean by this term when we use it? But also important is the way in which the discourse mobilizes race. I've already sort of mentioned how the earlier campaigns were racialized and had anti-immigrant underpinnings in that early white slave traffic discourse. And in many ways, this has continued. So while anti-trafficking is reinscribed all over the world and has been taken up by most governments, it is primarily designed and planned by campaigners of the global north. It is a new, as I have written about elsewhere, a new white woman and man's burden, a new justification of Euro-American imperialism motivated by a high-minded desire or duty of imperial colonizing powers to uplift people of color, the colonized, the indigenous, the brown and the black peoples of the world. That's where it comes from. It comes from the UN, comes from the global north. Now, a number of recent studies have suggested this type of racism, colonialism, imperialism, / are not only visible, but vital to the success of contemporary anti-trafficking campaigns and discourses and movements. It's been argued, for example, that anti-trafficking discourses still locate white women in prostitution as the real victims, white or light-skinned women, who are in need of rescue, while identifying migrants and women of color or racialized minorities as criminals who deserve surveillance, criminalization, forced rehabilitation, and deportation. So Canadian scholars, such as Sarah Hunt, Julie Kay, and Robin Maynard, who've all done research on Indigenous and Black women in Canada, point out that these racialized dynamics reproduce white settler colonial framings about who is deserving of assistance, while other scholars, such as Elia Durisin, show that they bolster middle-class white feminine subjectivity and white paternal masculinity. Moreover, anti-trafficking fundraising and awareness campaigns are seen to deploy visual images of suffering, of manacles, barred windows, slave ships, half-naked enslaved women, that are appropriated and taken from images of enslaved Africans from the past, with little to no acknowledgement of the historical black suffering and the ongoing legacies of slavery and all the anti-black discriminations that we have throughout the Americas, not just in North America. Other scholars, such as Julie O'Connell Davidson and Mike Dotteridge, argue that as with modern anti-slavery discourses, anti-trafficking obscures the hyper-exploitation of racialized labor from the transatlantic slave trade to the present. So that history of the exploitation of black people is erased in the current anti-trafficking discourse. Moreover, it is argued, anti-trafficking tends to place blames for the woes of human trafficking on poor, often racialized communities and non-Western countries as a result of their bad culture and or family values, while white helping imperatives that underpin many humanitarian projects and things such as anti-trafficking reality tours replicate structures of inequality between West and East, North and South. Elaine She has been doing and Elizabeth Bernstein have been doing work on this in the United States, but also in China. Additionally, they argue, or scholars like them argue, the uncontested authority of whiteness has enabled the proliferation of new forms of racial vigilantism, including racial profiling that is embedded in anti-trafficking awareness campaigns and policy. So these kind of trends that we're seeing around the world. So in short, what we're arguing is that much of the anti-trafficking discourse today borrows from the older anti-prostitution, white slavery, and slavery abolitionist discourses. And what we have is a neoliberal, or neo-colonial, if you like, white chivalrous campaign across the world that shores up the power and subjectivity of the North with the developing global South and East as the sites for helping imperatives involving rescue and charity. Now, it doesn't always just come directly from the North, of course. It's also embedded in our local and national consciousness. And in the outpouring of outrage that fuels the crusades, the wretched of the earth, as Fanon talks about it, or, if you like, the subaltern, the marginalized, the minoritized, are spoken for and represented, but rarely are they positioned as authorities on human trafficking as voices in their own right. And so we have, for example, I'll show you two slides here, the organizations such as the Walk Free Foundation that was founded by Andrew Forrest, who's a philanthropist and the chairman of a group, and he's one of the fourth largest iron ore supplier in the world, right? Australian. He created the Global Slavery Index that ranks the world's countries according to their estimated prevalence of modern-day slavery. And by modern-day slavery, they mean slavery, debt bondage, and trafficking. So trafficking is included here, subsumed within this idea of slavery. Now, ironically, I think Forrester doesn't seem to recognize that it's his own prosperity and the kind of money that he's able to do philanthropic work with, his prosperity and his power, was accumulated on the backs of poor people who very likely had no other options than to work in the mines, in the extractive industries, to become what he would call modern slaves or trafficked victims. Mining is, after all we know, a highly exploitative industry. It is often dirty and dangerous, right? And then on the other side, we have the sex organizations such as VAMP in India, who do a lot of work on the ground and make sure that young women are not forced into the sex trade, and they seek to make themselves safe from violence, and they resist, as you can see, being saved or rescued from sex work. But they are not seen as representative of the anti-trafficking movement. Who we do see are these guys, these people, right? They are not ever represented as part of our movement. Now, a century ago, Emma Goldman, who, other than Fanon, is one of my other sources of inspiration, she was an anarchist feminist who championed workers' rights and women's emancipation, and many other things such as free love of free speech, birth control. She was also very highly critical of the bourgeois feminist movement of the time. This was in the early 20th century. She published an article called The Traffic in Women in 1911. There she critiqued what she saw as a hypocritical and morally conservative crusade against prostitution. She saw it, and I quote, as a, I quote her, righteous cry against the traffic in women that served to amuse the people for a little while and will help create a few more fat political jobs, parasites who stalk about the world as inspectors, investigators, detectives, and so forth. And she went on to say that it is much more profitable to pretend an outraged morality than to go to the bottom of things. Yet a century later, we are still not getting to the bottom of things. Anti-trafficking rhetoric obscures global problems that lie at the heart of what is identified as trafficking, forced labor, or forced migration, and wants us to believe that what we are dealing with are exceptional situations rather than practices that have been and continue to be integral to the working of the global world order for the past 500 years and are central to the operation of the modern nation state. It suspends curiosity about why and how such problems are caused. It does not urge us to see how exclusionary claims to environmental and social resources are implicated in global corporate production, in border and immigration controls, in religious fundamentalism, in neoliberal politics, or in masculine privilege. It masks the working of capital, the relations of power and dominance between the global north and south, between masculinity and femininity, between whiteness and otherness, between the colonizer and the colonized. We need also to keep in mind that anti-trafficking has never really been about protecting human rights. It's primarily about law and order and about criminal justice. And so instead of helping us to see the injustices and the kind of structural problems, we are instead mobilized to decry the evils of trafficking. So anti-trafficking is, I'm arguing, a rhetoric that stirs up a moral panic about a number of social issues that are deemed a threat to the liberal Western democratic nation state. It arrests our attention. It's easy to focus on, but it does not fix any structural causes or problems. Just take a sip. So apart from the problems with the rhetoric itself or the discourse itself, yes, I have to sort of do this disappearing act behind here. The glass is too tall to fit in the ledge. So apart from the problems with the rhetoric itself, interventions in the name of anti-trafficking have what many people around in the field call collateral damage, and I'm sure this is a term that's familiar with some of you. There's unintended consequences or effects, if you like, the side effects of anti-trafficking interventions. And they include things like stronger anti-prostitution ideologies, greater criminalization of sex work, the infantilizing rescue missions to save women and girls, which they kind of object to, greater surveillance of the sex trade, programs to catch traffickers, and there are all kinds of things going on, including, for example, it's been documented going into Australia where young Asian women, luggage is searched to see if they have a lot of lingerie in their suitcase or not, right? Things like that. new legislation to apprehend and shame clients of prostitutes. We've seen that in the Swedish Nordic model for, around prostitution, which has been adopted by Canada as well as the Dutch and the French, where some clients are being threatened with jail. We see more border controls to prevent aliens from entering wealthy areas of the world. Right now, that's pretty intense up and down this corridor here. We see people getting stuck between refugee and trafficked victim status, right? And they'll be held in detention, they're deported, returned home, or sometimes maybe even re-trafficked. And there's this suspicion of foreign men and racialized men as the main traffickers. We see the evasion of rescuers, professionalization of underground sectors, and the individualization of the problem. In other words, rather than seeing state, corporations, immigration systems, and capitalism as creating forced labor and irregular migration patterns, it is seen as a case of a problem of a few bad individuals and individual victims. Again, that's the kind of exceptionalizing of this situation of trafficking. Now, I give you a couple of examples from our region. And I work on the Caribbean, particularly, which includes some parts of South America and Latin America. So in Guyana, in 2015, there was a raid that took place in Bartica in Guyana. Bartica is a sort of gateway town between the coast and the inland. It's probably like Iquitos going into the Amazon, right? Iquitos is not in Ecuador, right? But it's in Peru. But it's that sort of gateway town where a lot of the miners and the loggers will come to buy supplies, to refresh themselves, and so forth. And there's also a lot of places where sex work takes place. Now, there was a raid of 2 hotels in that town in 2015. It led to the arrest of 27 women, mostly Latinas, from the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela, who were believed to be the victims of human trafficking. Of the 27 of those women, 11 were charged, 4 with overstaying their visas, right? And 7 with illegal entry, undocumented migration. And they faced deportation. The rest were detained, and they were to help the police with their investigations into the matter. They were all taken away from Bartica, taken away from the places they were working, and sent to the capital for further processing. The women were paraded through the town. You were only seeing the backs of them, but they were paraded through the town before a crowd of approximately 300 people, and photos of them, their faces, appeared in the local newspapers. The raid was led by the Minister of Social Protection with a team of officers from the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Unit in Guyana and the Guyana Women Miners Association. According to the reports, the team apprehended anyone who did not have a Guyanese identification card or passport with them, right? So a number of questions can be raised here. Was there, in the first instance, any evidence that the women were forced against their will? Or were they there on their own accord, working to make a living for themselves and their families? Did having their photos in the paper or being paraded through the town in front of the townspeople make them look good? Or did it expose them as sex workers and shame them? Yeah. Was it really a case of rescuing trafficked victims, or something else? Was it perhaps clearing the country of illegal migrants, so-called illegal migrants, improving the country's status in the US government's or international community's eyes and assessment? Or is it an act of xenophobia to keep out Latinas from an English-speaking country? We do know that in the name of anti-trafficking, working women were arrested, detained, and deported. And this is a very common kind of situation that we face. We can also think about situations that are happening in the Dominican Republic. And I turned to some research that was done recently by Amalia Cabezas and Ana Alcazar Campos about Dominicanas, women from the Dominican Republic in Puerto Rico. Among these women who work as barmaids in the capital, they found that stigmas and discriminations around race and sexual labor combined to position the women outside of the nation, as well as outside of trafficking discourses. So they found that although the women were in very vulnerable positions in Puerto Rico, they were working in terrible conditions, and they had very precarious statuses. Some of them didn't have visas to be there or not, right? And they were being pushed around to do things that they didn't necessarily want to do. They were not being given any attention in the form of either rescue under anti-trafficking initiatives or any other social service or protection. Being stereotyped as hypersexual, black, and illegal, the women were both invisible as citizens and hypervisible as racialized subjects, and were seen to conform to neither the image of the sex slave or that of the trafficked victim. Instead, the researchers found the women were despised and subjected to xenophobia and discrimination. So surely we need to be asking here, why are some migration and working conditions being overlooked? Why are some women being vilified and only some seen as deserving of rescue? A third example from the Brazil-Peru-Colombia border. Research by Jose Miguel Nieto Olivar in Brazil has traced the mobilization of human trafficking discourse in the Amazon town of Tabatinga, and found that starting with training by the Catholic Church, anti-trafficking was taken up by the local health, social services, human rights, children's rights, and women's rights agencies. It was first applied under the banner of violence against women, in which sex work was conflated with trafficking, right? Sex work and prostitution are seen to be the same thing as trafficking. Oliver found that it also infantilized indigenous women and produced an image of indigenous Amazonian culture as the cause of violence against the women, with the cross-border movement, especially from Peru, being defined as the source of crime, threats, and the young women's involvement in sex work in Brazil. The consequences of such mobilization, of the mobilization of such a discourse, Oliver argues, was, or he found really, was greater border surveillance, spectacular raids on brothels, the rescue of ethnically marked, as he puts it, adolescent girls, the denigration of indigeneity, and the production of an image of the Amazon region as a site of backwardness. The research then presents us with a case where Catholic concerns about sexual morality, combined with political efforts to secure the nation and eradicate violence against women, resulted in the construction of anti-trafficking ideas, policies and interventions that maintained an image of the Amazon region as uncivilized. This, he argues, reinvigorated colonial and nationalist practices and discourses. So in these examples, I'm going to wrap up here. Anti-trafficking discourse in the Latin American and Caribbean context appears to work as a disciplining and regulatory device that disadvantages young migrant and indigenous women, reproducing xenophobia, racism, and colonialism, rather than working as a support for social and economic empowerment and emancipation. So to return to the start of the idea of the pitfalls of anti-trafficking. As Fanon wrote about neocolonial liberal nationalism, The problem is not just a distorted consciousness that is mobilized by a dominant social group. In our case, an elite that is predominantly white, nationalist, non-sex working, anti-prostitution, religious, and xenophobic. It is also about the incapacity of the dominant group to attribute the problem to any reasons other than immorality, backwardness, and individual corruption, and its incapacity to bring about some kind of enlightenment amongst the rest of the population. It inculcates a neocolonialism, a paternalism or a maternalism, and an elitism, a helping imperative for the West to save the rest, or as Gayatri Spivak puts it, a strategy for white men to save brown women from brown men. That's her quote. Or as we see in the region, a way for the ruling elite to save the poor from themselves and their local cultures. The anti-trafficking framework that is being mobilized in the Caribbean and Latin America does not challenge reigning relations of power, of coloniality, race, and gender, nor does it seek to expand human rights, and signals a politics that not only maintains the status quo, but fundamentally privileges Western conceptions of man over human, the white global north over the dark, uncivilized third world, and the sexually chaste over the sexually free. It depends upon spectacularism as well as control of the population through fear and police force and through misinformation. Moreover, as Goldman tells us, this consciousness sets out to abolish vice and purify the nation by ridding the nation of prostitutes as well as undesirables, the migrants, the indigenous, racialized minorities, refugees, and so forth. Yet she says, as she says, this moral crusade accomplishes nothing, save driving the cause out of sight. So in short, I'm offering here saying that anti-trafficking needs to be examined and rethought if it is to do any good, any social good, any economic good. Or as anti-critical, anti-trafficking advocates have been arguing for over a century, let us just get rid of the rhetoric altogether and really get to the bottom of things. And I'll just put up here 2 slides from the Retrosex Latin American network that in fact also takes on anti-trafficking, but in their own way, through really working with sex workers around the region to combat the force and violence that sex workers face, right? And then we have, of course, sex workers around the world united against violence, which of course includes the kind of force that we sometimes talk about in anti-trafficking. But these are the kind of voices we also need to hear and listen to as we go forward with our work. So that's where I will leave it now, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. Thank you.
Vamos a abrir una ronda de preguntas. Podemos tomar primero unas 5 preguntas para que Kamala pueda responder. ¿Alguna pregunta? A ver, aquí hay 1, 2, 3, 4 y una más tomamos, o las 4. Allá primero, creo que. Espérate. Un ratito que se va a poner el…
Muy buenas noches.
¿Puedes esperar un momentito hasta que…
Hola. Buenas noches. El planteamiento estuvo realmente fantástico, muy interesante, revolucionario en medio del Congreso. Me gustó muchísimo lo que dijiste sobre que la antitrata no tiene que ver con proteger los derechos sino criminalizar a quienes hacen el mal. Entonces, esto me surge una inquietud que estamos ahora desde el Estado tratando de lograr el equilibrio entre la visión de la seguridad versus la versión garantista de los derechos humanos de los migrantes. Entonces, yo no sé si por favor podrías ampliar este planteamiento para que quede claro justamente a quién estamos defendiendo. Lo hemos visto en las mesas de esta tarde, que muchas veces se criminaliza el delito, pero no se atiende los derechos de las víctimas. Muchas gracias.
Acá había dos preguntas, por favor, dos.
Buenas noches. Soy representante de las trabajadoras sexuales trans y me gusta tu foro porque habla de tráfico de personas. Y en eso te apoyo mucho porque a nosotras como trabajadoras sexuales y trans nos marginan y prácticamente no valen nuestros derechos. Entonces, en ese aspecto hay tráfico entre las trabajadoras sexuales trans menores de edad, sí, porque los mismos padres incluyen y las trafican a las mismas hijos o hijas, les trafican ellos mismos y las venden. ¿Por qué? Por un objeto sexual y por ser trans y por ser una mujer. Esa es mi pregunta. ¿Por qué no hay una ley que los mismos padres venden a sus hijos y por qué no se multan a los mismos padres a la vez?
Buenas noches. Me gustó igual mucho tu presentación. Soy David González, soy presidente de una asociación de hombres trabajadores sexuales, Sex Workers, y estamos en una coalición de trabajo sexual aquí en Quito. Como tú bien dices, a mí también me parece que el tema de la trata hay que verla desde su estructura, el concepto, ya que creo que está mirado, sobre todo aquí en Latinoamérica, desde una mirada errónea, desde una mirada muy victimizatoria, en donde nosotros como trabajadores sexuales como trabajadores y trabajadoras sexuales hemos sido muy violentados, discriminados y vulnerados en todos los sentidos: social, académico, cultural, económico, en género. Eso nos ha repercutido mucho. También el tema de que aquí en nuestra sociedad es muy colonialista, les encanta traer modelos extranjeros, que al igual que tú comparto que es perjudicial, un modelo nórdico acá, un modelo americano que va a penalizar al cliente o a penalizar al trabajador o la trabajadora sexual o ambos en este caso. No creemos que es la solución. Se han visto resultados que ese modelo no funciona, no aplica, no reduce la trata, todo lo contrario, la empeora. Nosotros aquí como coalición y sindicato estamos tratando de regularizar el trabajo sexual para que así se haya una reducción o total, quede nula lo que es el tema de trata, ya que creemos que el reconocimiento de nuestro trabajo ayudaría a promover que se reduzca la trata en las personas. Quiero indicarte mi camiseta. Mi camiseta dice igual: obreros del sexo unidos, trabajadores sexuales, somos orgullosos y por decisión y elección. Y creo que de entrada las personas deben saber la diferencia entre trabajo sexual y trata, que es algo muy importante y que hasta ahora no saben lo que significa. Muchas gracias.
Y aquí había una pregunta más. Les pido que sean puntuales por temas de tiempo en sus comentarios, un poco más cortos, por favor. Esas 4 preguntas y luego vamos a dejar, ¿ya? Luego tendremos otra ronda. No, acá.
Buenas tardes, muchas gracias por la presentación. Yo quisiera saber cuál es la propuesta desde el enfoque crítico que tú manejas para un abordaje integral y multidimensional de la trata de personas, entendiendo que el abordaje incluye diferentes tipos de actores: las personas afectadas, la sociedad civil, la ciudadanía en general, la sociedad civil organizada, el gobierno, organismos internacionales, etcétera. Gracias.
Thank you for your questions, and thank you to the translator for the interpreter for doing such a great job of, allowing me to hear them so well. So let me see if I can address a few things here. I think you're right. I think we do have to think about, how we think about security and human rights. And I think one of the big questions is whether we want to think about security as only security of particular group of people, why is it that we have to secure the nation? Against whom? Against who? I mean, who are we trying to keep out? Why? What is it that we feel has to be secured? Is it not possible that we can have open borders in this world? I'm a big supporter of that movement that allows people to live and to move and to work. But that would necessarily need to come with some kind of redistribution of wealth, right? And I think those two things are very critical to think about. Yes, they're the big picture, but that's where I'd like us to think towards. In which case, security and human rights, maybe we might secure human rights and see it in that way, right, for a group of people. Thank you for your comments about sex workers, in different ways. I think one of the things that I've learned from sex worker groups around the world is that, particularly the group that I showed in India, that they really do try to work with and monitor the sex trade to make sure, particularly in Calcutta, that young people are not coming into the sex work, right? And so what we might think of, or some people might think of as the trafficking of young women, they are actually actively preventing or stopping young people from entering the sex trade if they are under a certain age. That is sex workers who are doing it themselves, so they are kind of keeping minors out of the sex trade. And I think that that's a very good strategy, right? Because it addresses some of the things that we see, that we talk about as trafficking. And I argue that a lot of the laws that we have in place that to protect children's rights, right? To protect workers' rights, to protect health and safety at the workplace, are actually all in place. They're all in place at the UN level, and they're mostly in place at the national level. So we don't necessarily need new anti-trafficking laws to actually do that, to prosecute parents if they are abusing their children. That's an abuse of children's rights, and that is covered under conventions about the rights of the child, right, and all the laws that our nations have signed, our governments have signed on. So we don't actually need anti-trafficking to address those kind of issues, I would argue, right? That's my position on it. We don't need more and more laws. We have enough laws to actually deal with the kind of abuse that we are seeing, the violence that we're seeing around the world. We don't really need extra. And in that regard, I do agree that if we were to actually take away a lot of the criminalization of prostitution and sex work, we would allow a lot of people to work safely. Because they would then fall under the regular labor laws and health and safety laws, and may have to pay taxes like everybody else as well on that. But I mean, they would be workers under the same laws and protections that the rest of us work under. So that's how. That's why I would agree with you. That would also then reduce a lot of the violence and force that we see in the sex trade that is allowed to happen, right? Because a lot of it is underground. A lot of it's happening in illegal sectors. And it's because of the laws that are keeping it illegal that allow this kind of violence and abuse of rights, right? So I would certainly work towards, and I encourage people to work towards the regularization of sex work or the decriminalization of prostitution. And in terms of an integral policy, I think, as I've said, as I kind of alluded to, we already have a lot of laws that take care of labor exploitation, forced labor, violence, sexual violence, and so forth. Do we really, so can we mobilize those? Can we work with those, with all the various different sectors to actually make sure that they're actually in place? Do we need another layer of laws and policies? Is my question. Do we not have enough in place to actually rid the world of the kind of force and violence that we're seeing happening in the workplace and in migration? I think we do. I think we do. We have them at the UN level and we have them at national levels. So why do we need to talk about, why do we need something in the name of anti-trafficking? Those are my brief responses, and I'm sure we could talk about much more, but if there are more questions or comments, I'd be happy to take them. I'm not sure how we're doing for time.
Tal vez dos preguntas más, una y una más por el tema del tiempo, ¿ya? Entonces, acá había una primera que pidieron.
Buenas noches. Usted está planteando que en estas relaciones coloniales norte-sur está en el centro el racismo y me hace pensar en Rita Segato. Pero la pregunta es cómo se articula Naciones Unidas en esas relaciones y en este tema.
¿Puedes repetir la pregunta? Porque no entendió muy bien la pregunta. Sí.
Usted plantea que en las relaciones coloniales entre norte y sur, en el centro de las reflexiones o en el centro de esta relación está el racismo. Y le pregunto cómo se articula en estas relaciones este organismo internacional de Naciones Unidas, porque cumple un papel en el mundo y cumple un papel, desde mi punto de vista, demasiado tímido y ahorita es un momento importante con todo lo que está pasando en el mundo. ¿Cuál es ese papel de Naciones Unidas en estas relaciones, ¿no? Estas relaciones coloniales, racistas?
Una más solamente, sí.
Buenas noches, muchas gracias. Kamala, me da mucho gusto escucharte y quería preguntarte algunas cosas junto con una reflexión, porque investigando un poco sobre tu trabajo, veo que partes del feminismo radical que surge en Estados Unidos desde esta crítica al colonialismo, al racismo, y eso me parece excelente, y también lo que marcas de la interseccionalidad de la violencia, como tomar en cuenta la clase, la raza, lo colonial, para poder entender esto. Hay algunas cosas en las que no estoy de acuerdo, y es lo que quería plantear para que se pueda generar un diálogo. Yo llevo 10 años trabajando con mujeres en situación de prostitución, soy antropóloga y socióloga, y mi visión es abolicionista. Parto, como tú también, hay coincidencias en que por ningún motivo tiene que haber una criminalización de las mujeres y de las personas que están en situación de prostitución. Es decir, no se tiene que mirar a la prostitución como un delito. Lo que sí creo es, no toda prostitución es trata, como todas las políticas antitrata que vienen desde arriba tratan de hacerlo ver, pero yo considero que la prostitución para las mujeres, las personas trans con las que he trabajado también, implica violencia. Y muchas de ellas lo dicen, no toda prostitución es trata, pero toda prostitución es violencia. Y entonces hubo algunas palabras que desde el feminismo radical abolicionista se parte de, hablamos de patriarcado y hablamos de capitalismo, y fueron dos palabras que estuvieron ausentes en tu conferencia. Y me parece que la geopolítica también es muy importante. ¿Cómo la miras tú? Porque como preguntaba la compañera respecto al papel de la ONU, yo tengo una mala relación con la ONU, 2 años he sido invitada y precisamente ha sido desde el tema de cómo van construyendo las políticas que bajan hacia América Latina y hacia países que hemos sido colonizados, y es una forma de intervención. Por ejemplo, en México, después del protocolo de Palermo, se firmó el plan Mérida, que tiene que ver con la securitización, es decir, la intervención de Estados Unidos en nuestro país. Y a partir de eso tenemos al FBI operando en México y diferentes estrategias que sí criminalizan a las mujeres, pero que no están erradicando el problema real, que es la violencia. Y lo que he notado es que a mayor regulación de la prostitución, más feminicidios y más violaciones. Entonces, creo que es muy importante que visibilicemos la violencia implícita y que la prostitución es anterior al sistema capitalista y la trata parte del capitalismo como un proceso de acumulación originaria y que no debemos confundirlos, pero que sí tenemos que resaltar que es una forma de control histórica sobre las personas y sus cuerpos. Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions, comments. I'm not going to defend. I'm not a spokesperson for the UN, and nor do I think the UN has the answers. And the UN is dominated by the global North countries and particular countries. So I think the UN also reproduces some of those kind of colonial, and imperial problems. So I wouldn't look to the UN to actually solve it, right? That's my position. The UN tries to be a leader in global affairs, but there's a lot more that the UN has to pay attention to and to take on board. So that's my sort of feeling about it. I don't think the UN can actually eradicate racism if it felt like. I think it's got to come from other impulses, definitely. Yeah. But, and in terms of, and maybe you wanted to get something else, but I'm not sure. But in terms of the radical feminist understanding of prostitution, as it is a fundamentally different paradigm that I work with, and analysis, and I find it hard to see prostitution as violence inherently, because in doing that, I would have to also think that marriage is also violence, veiling is also violence. Most of the gender relations that we see are violence, and I would not want to actually put them all in that, see them all in that way. And I don't see why one would be made to be more violent than the other. Why one is acceptable, marriage is acceptable, but prostitution is not. I don't understand how, as feminists, we could actually make that claim, our argument. The places where prostitution has been decriminalized, such as in Australia and in New Zealand, even in Las Vegas and other places around the world, we do see less violence towards sex workers because they are working legally. And I think that's important to recognize. I think if we have more controls about the women around prostitution, around their health, as was tried under sort of disease acts, regulation of HIV and so forth, that can be very harmful to the sex workers. So, but it's a different paradigm, it's a different position, and I think, that's a debate that is ongoing. It is a very fundamentally different kind of analysis about gender that we have, I think. But thank you for your question, and thank you for your work as well.
Muchas gracias, Kamala, por esa conferencia. Gracias también por sus preguntas. Y ahora les invitamos, por favor, a la inauguración de la muestra fotográfica Migrar es tocar tierra. En este momento vamos a empezar. Y les recordamos también que las mesas empiezan mañana a las 8:30 de la mañana. Gracias.